Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're talking about content moderation, what some people call censorship, on the major social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And my guest today, Corynne McSherry, is the Legal Affairs Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation in California, one of the organizations that has for a long time been committed to digital rights, issues involving privacy and access, really a sort of First Amendment ACLU kind of organization, but focusing on the digital universe. And we're going to be talking about who should decide the really tough issues of what is speech, what speech can be regulated, how it can be regulated, and what are some steps beyond government regulation for those of you who don't really want the government involved in this business. I don't. And many of you, I'm sure, feel similarly concerned about that idea. But what are some of the other ways that content can be regulated, both through tools that the social media platforms can put up, through transparency about what is and is not being posted, that sort of thing. It's a really fascinating conversation about a very timely topic. I know you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned. On today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law, we're going to be talking about content moderation, what some people might call censorship. There's been a lot in the news about this recently as Facebook announced that it was banning from its site some pretty high-profile individuals whose speech, it was decided, is the type of speech that needs to be completely off Facebook altogether. Louis Farrakhan, Alex Jones of the conspiracy website InfoWars, and a couple of others as well. And my guest today, Corynne McSherry, is someone very knowledgeable on the subject of content moderation. So I first of all want to thank you very much, Corynne, for being on the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Corynne, you're the legal director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco, my hometown. Tell us about EFF and what you do there.
Sure. So EFF's been around for about 25 years now, which we are all sometimes surprised to realize. And we focus on defending digital rights in various ways. So the core of the organization is a group of lawyers, the team that I lead, and we focus on litigation and policy work, mostly litigation, but we also do some work with our friends in D.C. to try to make sure that bad laws don't get passed, and bad laws sometimes can be made better. But then we also do a lot of impact litigation around the country on issues relating to your privacy rights, so online privacy, freedom of expression, fair use, and innovation. And then, we've expanded beyond the legal team over the past 10 years in particular. So now we also have a group of technologists that focus on building tools to protect your privacy. And we have a group of activists that focus on sort of raising public awareness about digital issues, and including things like content moderation, but a whole wide variety of sort of internet-related problems. We work on net neutrality. We've been making people aware of issues around mass surveillance and also local surveillance. So we cover a pretty wide gamut of issues. Pretty much if it has to do with civil liberties and technology, that's our thing. That's where we'll be.
Well, this episode is going to be unofficially a continuing look at a lot of issues relating to digital privacy. We had a lawyer on. By the time this episode airs, we had a lawyer on who's representing a class of consumers who are victims of or are at risk of being victims of these massive data breaches, companies like Equifax and the Marriott hotel chain. And we also will have heard from, our listeners will have heard from an expert in cybersecurity because of the ever-widening scope of cyber hacking crimes that are affecting individuals and businesses. So I'm really pleased that we're going to be getting into this aspect of a digital privacy and some of the work that you've been doing. Can before we get into some of the substance of the issue we're going to be talking about today, can you give us a couple of examples of the types of impact litigation you and EFF have been working on over the last year or so?
Sure. So one thing that we've been doing over the past year, but actually over the past decade, I'm sorry to say, because it does go on, is we've been challenging the government, the U.S. federal government's mass surveillance of the Americans' emails and other digital communications, which we believe is unconstitutional. And
does that actually happen? I'm kidding.
It happens all the time. And unfortunately, the struggle has been to get a court to be able to reach the merits. There's been a lot of sort of procedural hoops that we've had to get through, because on the merits, we think, that's unquestionable. We have a very, very strong argument that what the NSA did is simply unconstitutional, full stop. But there's a lot of procedural hoops to get through to get to the merits on that. And in other areas, one of the things that we're working on right now is a case where we are defending the right to anonymous speech. We have a religious organization that is trying to unmask a person that commented on them on Reddit, and there's a strong First Amendment test that makes it difficult to unmask a DOE unless you've got very solid, valid legal claims, which in this case the religious organization does not. That's a relatively small case on our docket, but we actually think it's pretty important. That's the kind of thing. Sometimes we engage in sort of big, huge class actions, and sometimes we engage in sort of relatively small cases, but ones that involve important constitutional rights, like the right to speak online anonymously.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to talk about content moderation. Again, Facebook has really been most prominently in the news lately on this issue. Maybe we could start by defining the term. What does content moderation mean in as we're going to be talking about it today?
Sure. So content moderation can govern a wide variety of activities, but the sort of short version is it's the work that platforms do, and by platforms I mean Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, all the different sort of social media services that host content, YouTube, and it's work that they do to control the content that they host. So decisions about what to keep up, what to take down, decisions about what to maybe demote so you can find it, but it's harder to find. Or in the case of something very recently, Facebook decided to demote a video, and also when you go to see it, you would see some information about it, so as a way of trying to fight disinformation. So it's basically how platforms handle the content that they host.
Now, I think the other thing we have to really get out as we dive into this issue is what probably most people assume is directly on point here when we talk about regulating content, which is the First Amendment.
Sure.
So how does now the First Amendment says that the government shall, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it right in front of me, but that the government shall pass no law that would impact the freedom of speech. So how is the First Amendment, generally speaking, implicated when we're talking about a private company like Facebook or Twitter?
That's a really, really good question, because there's a lot of confusion about this issue on the part of a lot of people. So the First Amendment protects the right of the platforms to make decisions about what they're going to host or not. They're private forums, they're private companies, and as such, they are allowed to decide what they want to host and what they don't want to host. And people often get confused about this, and they think that they think that the platform should be required to host certain kinds of content or take certain kinds of content down. And if we ever had a regulation to that effect, it would face a very serious First Amendment challenge. Another thing that people think a lot is that they have a First Amendment right to have their speech hosted on a platform, on YouTube or Facebook or whatever, but they don't. In fact, because the platforms don't have to host them if they choose not to. So that can be very frustrating for people, but that's the sort of legal reality.
So when we talk about Facebook, we'll again just use that, because of the prominence of Facebook, and the prominence of some of the decisions, therefore, that Facebook makes. Recently announcing that they were going to ban Louis Farrakhan and Alex Jones and some others. Is there a problem with that?
Well, legally, there isn't. Legally, Facebook has the right to make that choice if they want to. But one of the things, just because they have the right to make that choice, there's a separate question of whether they should. So you can say that the social media companies have the legal right to be sort of judge and jury over speech, but it's a very different question whether we want them to be exercising that right so freely, because the reality is that decisions that, especially a company like Facebook, which is such a powerful platform, the decisions that they make about expression have huge ramifications. And I think it's very easy for many of us to say, well, I really don't like, X person or Y person, so I don't care if they take them down. But the problem is it's going to be a slippery slope. And when we start calling on the platforms to take down everybody we don't like, I worry that we're going to find ourselves in 5 years from now, all kinds of speech will have been taken down because it will be labeled as terrorist or hate speech or something else that we don't like. And it's going to end up sweeping up a lot of speech that actually is perfectly legal and in fact has been misidentified, or speech that today, might be identified as abhorrent or unpleasant. Tomorrow we might think wasn't so bad. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but the way that I think about it, if you sort of take the longer view, there's a lot of speech about gay rights, transgender rights, and sexuality that 2 decades ago many people would have found deeply, deeply offensive. And now we don't think about it that way. We think, no, it's actually important that, the internet is a place where people can talk freely about a lot of different things. So that's, when you take the long view, you really start to wonder whether it's such a great idea that we have these very, very powerful platforms sort of anointing themselves and us anointing them as speech police.
Well, and before we get to some of the questions of what can or what should be done about this, I was mentioning to you before we started recording that I'd seen this article in an online publication called The Verge from just a couple of months ago, which sort of went undercover or talked to a lot of people who work for one of the companies that Facebook contracts with to make hundreds of decisions every day about specific pieces of content and whether they meet Facebook guidelines as to what is allowed to be posted, or put differently, what should be banned and not posted per Facebook's guidelines. And it gives some examples which I think illustrate what you're talking about, which is that slippery slope and some of the problems of definition here. And just to one that's close to home, I have a stepson with autism, and I was really struck by the fact that according to this article and the individuals who were interviewed, the statement autistic people should be sterilized is a statement that is not subject to Facebook's internal policies that would ban hateful speech. Because according to the article, autism is not a, quote, protected characteristic. But if somebody posts men should be sterilized, because now it's a statement that applies to a gender, that statement would not be allowed on Facebook.
Right.
And it's horrific to think that somebody would post a statement that autistic people should be sterilized. And yet, as soon as you get into the business of saying this is not allowed and that's not allowed because it is, quote, hateful, then you're going to get into some of these slicing and dicing type, problems with what is and what is not acceptable.
That's exactly right. And look, there are some categories of content that are simply illegal. And lots of the social media companies, have banded together, and rightfully so, to, try to get that content off their site. And I'm thinking here of child pornography, and that's pretty much the category. So it is not to say that there should be no content moderation ever. And in fact, I tend to think that the world that I'd like to see, that I think was the original vision of the internet, was a world in which you could have lots and lots and lots of different platforms and from which to choose. And some of them would be very actively moderated. And if that's kind of the space you want to go live in with your friends, then that's fine, right? That's great. But maybe there'd be some other forums that were less moderated. And, that's another place that you could go and find information and share conversations. The problem with, I think, with the internet we have right now is there's a very small number of platforms that have huge amount of influence. There's lots and lots and lots of social media platforms, don't get me wrong. But we know that YouTube, Facebook, to some extent Twitter, are hugely influential. So the decisions that they make have a huge, huge impact. And then that's paired with the problem that I think you're speaking to as well, which is that they're facing almost an impossible task, in my view. I mean, I think that you can see why Facebook might design a policy that said, okay, well, there's no, we don't want people saying mean things based on a protected category. Gender's a protected category. That's very sensible, in line with American jurisprudence, and our way of thinking about things. But of course, as you point out, what that means is you can't say mean things about men, which are structurally a pretty powerful group as a group. But you can say mean things about and awful things about autistic people. That's just doesn't make intuitive sense to people. But to me, the right answer isn't, okay, well, let's just keep adding on to the categories of people you can't say mean things about, because then you're going to be in a position where where does it end? And maybe what instead we should be doing is realizing that we're asking Facebook to do the impossible.
Well, and that same person who was interviewed about those two different statements, that you can't say the hateful or mean thing about men, but you can about autistic people. Then they realized that, well, lots of people post things in kind of the heat of a romantic breakup, for example. And if it's in that context, if a person posts, and this is the example given in the article, I just broke up with my boyfriend and I hate all men, that's allowed. So the way, when you get down layer upon layer upon layer through these issues, what is and isn't acceptable, you can see almost ridiculous distinctions. And if you're coming at this idea that even though I don't agree with the speech, even if I find it disturbing or hateful, pick your word, offensive, dangerous, as long as it's not actually inciting to violence, then shouldn't it be allowed?
Right.
Shouldn't that speech be allowed? I mean, I think that's right. So that's the impossibility, I think, is what you're saying for a company like Facebook. How can they slice and dice through every imaginable situation where somebody posts something that some group of people is going to find offensive?
Right. No, that's exactly right. And again, and this is why I get very worried that I think that there's a lot of pressure on them to be doing more and more active, moderation. Oh, we call it private censorship over here at EFF. But they're under a lot of pressure to do it more and more because, people look at Facebook and they see that there's terrible stuff on there and they don't like it, which is understandable, right? Absolutely understandable. But I think that we're sort of engaging in a sort of collective magical thinking because we're asking them again to do something that I just think is not realistic. And keep in mind that we're asking Facebook to do a lot of content moderation. And of course, they've got lots and lots and lots of money to throw at it. But not most of the platforms actually don't. I mean, I'm not talking here about the Googles of the world. Google's fine. YouTube is fine. But there's other smaller platforms that, may not be able to throw, literally millions of dollars at content moderation and, hire all these people to do it. And I worry a lot that we may be seeing some actual, regulations that will ask them or sort of international best practices agreements that will be calling on platforms big and small to be engaging in this kind of moderation, and we're giving them all an impossible task.
Well, this must propose a rather strange dilemma for someone like you and EFF, because here you are defending institutionally against censorship, but in order to do that consistently, you also have to defend a behemoth like Facebook, which does wield such great influence. Or do you not really defend Facebook for some different reason?
Well, I tend to think my job is not to defend Facebook, because Facebook has an army of lawyers that are perfectly well qualified to do it.
Right.
They don't need.
No, I didn't mean actually going to court to defend them, but
no, I know.
Yeah.
But what I do feel that I have to defend is the next Facebook, because for me, what I want is actually a world in which Facebook isn't actually so very powerful. I want a world in which the decisions of one individual platform don't have such an outsized impact. So I want a world in which another social media company, can rise up and get extremely powerful and actually compete with Facebook, so that people have choices, and they don't have to rely so much on the decisions of a relatively small group of people from Silicon Valley. So
why is that a good thing, Corynne? Why is that a good thing? In other words, if and some people do think of Facebook as having something like a monopoly in this segment of the market in social media. Why is that a bad thing for someone like yourself who is committed to openness and non-censorship in speech, whether it be public or private?
Well, because I think when we have choices, we can vote with our feet, we can vote with our wallets, we can vote with our attention span. So, and this was, I think, the original vision of the internet was a place where anybody could log on and say just about anything to just about anybody else. And that was the original idea, and that is still, a big part of internet culture. And so when we have choices, it's fine if you have some platforms that really want to actively, moderate and shut down lots and lots of speech, because I have another place that I can go and reach out and get information. So when you have only one company, or three companies, I think we have sort of an oligopoly, that where the decisions they make really are going to shape internet speech for everyone. I think that's a very, very dangerous place. I mean, if you think about it, in the days before the internet, and it still lingers now, we had to rely on traditional broadcast media to get information out, and newspapers to get information out and circulate information. And that meant that, we had a real problem where just a few companies would decide, we're going to elevate, this kind of set of ideas and people who look like this, and and a lot of stereotypes we would see in sort of traditional media. And one of the things that happened over time with the internet is you had a world where lots of different people could put themselves out there and experiment, out in public. And so people would, find people who looked like them and talked like them and could connect. And that's what the internet made possible. But what I see now and what I worry about now is that with the rise of a small group of very powerful social media companies, we're sort of reinstalling that kind of traditional media approach where you kind of have just a few gatekeepers on speech. And that seems like a real shame, and it'd be a real betrayal of what we could have with internet speech.
Well, you brought up the days of when the broadcast networks were much more influential. I know I don't know anybody who still watches even the local news, but I know a lot of people must still tune in for that. But in there, because we created this regulatory framework around the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, there was some regulation on speech content on the airwaves. Just ask Howard Stern, who left, so-called terrestrial radio for satellite radio, because of the limits that were imposed by the FCC on the content of speech on, traditional radio and television. Here, now, and you can argue, well, that should never have existed in the first place, and that might be a very valid argument to make, but we did have that and still do have that system in place today. But Facebook is an entirely private company. The internet has never been looked at in the same way the airwaves were looked at as something to regulate by government. Is that something that should happen? And there's a big debate on that. Even Mark Zuckerberg seems at points to be asking for the government to step in and regulate platforms like Facebook. And then there are those who say, oh my God, I don't want the government getting more involved than it already is. So how do you walk through that mess?
Right. So I think a couple things. One thing is that it's a little bit difficult for me to imagine a set of regulations that would target internet speech that wouldn't run afoul of the First Amendment. So we have a big, huge constitutional hurdle just to start with, and that's just a reality that I think folks in D.C. should keep in mind. I do think that you're quite right that even Zuckerberg has sort of called out for those regulations, and I kind of wonder if that was done really in good faith. I think it may be that he knows that in real life, the kind of regulations he's talking about would be unconstitutional anyway. So, it may be that he's just calling for that because he's tired of Facebook getting yelled at by everybody and their mother. So it's a way, really it's a publicity ploy. Related to that, I would like to say that I really, really wish that our friends in D.C. and in state capitals around, and really around the world would stop asking Silicon Valley executives what they should do about the internet. Because I actually don't think they're the right people to ask. I think there's a lot of other constituencies who depend on the internet to access information, to communicate with each other, to find each other. And there's also a lot of engineers and technologists that I work with and others work with who also have a few ideas about how the internet could be managed a little bit better. And we should probably be talking to them and not Mark Zuckerberg, because just because he's a rich guy doesn't mean he knows all that much about the question.
Well, for example, what would engineers and technologists offer as some of the ways in which this problem could be addressed in ways that it's not currently being addressed?
Well, I think there's a couple things that the engineers that I talk to tell me. One is they're very worried about internet regulation of all stripes for a different reason, because they sort of understand how the internet works. And they're concerned that if you start doing things like, for example, delisting websites, which is a thing that people have called to, sort of internet blacklists of websites, that actually leads to a kind of a dangerous place where you're kind of interfering with kind of basic internet infrastructure. At least it can lead to that. So that and can undermine internet security even. So that's sort of one set of problems. But the other thing that they tell me is that they would like to be able to build tools to help users control their own experience, use their own judgment to control their internet experience. So rather than having, a few, folks in Silicon Valley deciding what you should and should not see, you have the ability to decide what you should and should not see.
Yeah.
Now, there's
sort
a
of like
place for that
parental
too,
controls,
because you could end up, siloing yourself. And it's also true that you don't necessarily want to put all the burden on the user to do everything for themselves, because that could be a lot of work. But you can do things like, for example, I might have a friend who I trust And if they, block a certain user on Twitter, I trust them, and I'm going to block that user too. And so you have a tool called Block Together that makes it possible for you to sort of rely on someone else's decision making about who you're going to block and whose tweets you're going to see. That's just a tiny example, but I would love to see the millions of dollars that's being spent on content moderators around the world. Maybe we could take some of that money and invest in tools so that actually you put the control back in the hands of the user.
Well, but let's take some cases that are pretty extreme and test what we're saying with some of those really extreme cases. And again, some of these are talked about in this article that was in The Verge. I'll post a link to that in the description of this episode, since I've referred to it, people can see. But some of the things that the Facebook contractors are recognizing as easy cases of material that should not be posted, are things like videos of people being stabbed to death. We had tragically, this mass shooting in New Zealand, and there have been others where the person who commits these horrific, mass crimes is actually trying to get attention, not only to their violent acts, but to their ideology, however twisted, that motivated them to commit these horrific acts. And the contractors who work for Facebook recognize those as clear cases that shouldn't be posted. These workers experience all kinds of trauma, even some being diagnosed with PTSD, just from watching them for the purpose of determining they shouldn't be posted. So some of this material isn't just offensive, because they're words that some group doesn't like, perhaps with very good reason doesn't like. But some of this material is really so out there that maybe there is an argument that, I don't know, is there an argument in some way that it's just not even speech, and therefore the First Amendment doesn't apply to it?
I don't think we're going to get too far with that argument, because I think that, there are some things that there's a narrow category of speech that is might be characterized as incitement or direct violence, but even then, usually it's not going to be actionable in most cases, like it's a legal matter. I think we do better to move out of that for a second and rather think about it as, whether is this speech worthy of being on the internet at all? Should it be on the internet at all? That's one question. And then a separate question is, should a given platform host it? So with respect to the Christchurch video, obviously that was, awful, right? We know there's no question about it. And I don't think there's a lot of people who would quarrel with the decision on the part of a lot of platforms that they didn't want to host it. And, again, it's their right to make that choice, and it's hard to argue too stringently that no one should, that they should have to host it. I think there's a separate question, though, about whether that those videos should never be available to anyone ever, because, frankly, at this point, they are part of the historical record. And that's also true. So I worry a little bit if we should just say there's certain things that just can't exist ever on the internet anywhere, as opposed to a given platform shouldn't have to host it.
Well, and again, it does beg the question, who decides, right? Sure. Obviously that video does exist, the Christchurch video. Certainly law enforcement needs to see that video, have access to it, so you can't say it should be...
And maybe journalists might want to have access to it.
Journalists, yeah, sure.
It's newsworthy, but whatever else you want to say about it, I think you can't say it's not newsworthy.
Right, but I don't think there is a news organization other than maybe in the fringiest fringe corners of the hate part of the internet where that video was posted because it was newsworthy. But who should decide that? And again, the way that was handled was a collection of private decisions not to post it. Private decisions by private news organizations, by platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on. But can you really go beyond that? I mean, that's can you go further than that and say there is some category of speech that we can all agree simply shouldn't be or should be regulated so that it's banned everywhere, in at least in a kind of public form?
Well, so this is where it gets tricky. Tricky because I think we can point to specific examples and say, well, that's bad, right?
Right.
But when you want to move into regulation, you have to sort of make things a little bit more generic. You have to come up with categories. And that's where it gets very, very difficult. So, for example, there's a lot of pressure and some regulations abroad to require social media companies to take down what's called terrorist content that's classified as terrorist. But there were government officials in the United States that described Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization. Now, I think most people would not agree with that characterization. But you see where we can go with this. Alternatively, it was also true that there was an archive of war atrocities from the Syrian war that was put together by journalists and citizen journalists and was being used to sort of document and talk about what was going on in Syria, which is awful. And it included some pretty horrific videos. But the idea was we need to document what's happening here because people need to know. That archive was taken down because of its content. So this is why I say it's actually a lot harder than people think to try to come up with rules that are actually going to be consistent and aren't going to end up taking down all kinds of content that is actually valuable and really important.
Well, and we've made reference to this notion of speech that incites to violence a couple of times, and that is something that in our political world is being invoked more and more to refer to speech that you just don't like. And I'm not putting down the idea that there is speech that a person doesn't like or a group doesn't like. But, I think we've seen this from both Republicans and Democrats, really, that when, someone on the other side says something that as a political matter, it's now become more common to say that is speech that is inciting to violence. But that's a very narrow legal concept that carves out certain kinds of speech as not being protected under the First Amendment, right? So that's
right. I mean, legally, it's called a true threat. I mean, it's very, very narrow.
Right.
Legally, it's pretty hard to do, but rhetorically, apparently, it's very easy for everyone to sort of say, well, that must be terrible. Everybody's inciting everybody to violence, and context is really important. People don't do a very good job of sort of realizing that, someone may be saying something and they're saying it facetiously or they're saying it in the heat of the moment, but they're not, even on its face, like what the language can be read in different ways. And again, it gets back to why this is so very, very difficult. And I think, frankly, I get a little frustrated after working in the space for a very long time because I think, unfortunately, we're in this moment of, people call it the techlash. And what I see is a lot of policymakers that I fear are really just trying to score political points by complaining about Facebook and YouTube and so on. And the extra frustrating thing about this is there actually are real problems that we should be talking about. And we actually should be thinking about regulation. So, for example, we've got some very significant privacy problems with respect to sort of what we call, surveillance capitalism. But basically the business models of a lot of these social media companies depends on a lot of, basic privacy violations, frankly, and an unknowing consent to how your data is being handled. That's where I think we could appropriately be focusing. a lot of our attention.
Well, you're right. I think I completely agree that this issue of content moderation or censorship is being politicized. The White House recently launched a tool that I guess this is on the government's own website, where you can report instances where you feel there's been improper, I can't say unlawful, but improper censorship on one of the main social media platforms. So, that's coming from President Trump. That is clearly a politicization. He's really inviting, I think, his supporters to report instances where they have been blocked or in some other way had their content taken down.
Sure. And I'll be very interested to see what gets reported there.
Right.
And how that
Well,
works.
well, let me ask you about one other aspect of this, which is fake news. And I'm not talking about fake news perhaps the way our president talks about fake news, but actually fake news. We just saw a clearly altered video of Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, that was disseminated, and then it was recognized that it had been that it was an altered video and was fake or fraudulent, perhaps, and it was taken down pretty widely across the social media sphere. Is there a basis for thinking differently about that type of content in terms of regulation versus individual private controls over that, how that information gets disseminated?
Well, I actually think the Pelosi video is very interesting, and the way that Facebook handled it is quite interesting, because a lot of times we think about a lot of these issues in sort of black and white terms, and it's sort of an on and off switch. So, if it's bad, take it down or leave it up. Like, that's the only decision that a platform could possibly make. And Facebook made a different choice. Facebook said, we're going to leave it up because now, I do think it's also sort of part of the historical record. And newsworthy in itself. People might like to see how is this video doctored? Like, what is this?
And why was it doctored, and who did that, and why was it disseminated in the first place? Right.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so Facebook made a choice to have it be available, but as I understand it, it's demoted, and also they posted up along with some, fact-checking information. So if you go and you see it in a context, so that that will help you understand the context of the video, and you don't take it just at face value. I think that's tremendously interesting. I would love to see more experimentation like this, so that rather than just having stuff disappeared offline or disappeared off, the major platforms, you have a context for it. You have information. You actually, respect people enough to, provide them with more information as opposed to less. I think that's worth thinking about. And this is the kind of experimentation that I think we need.
Well, that would be a real change for Facebook, because for the longest time, Facebook and platforms like it would say, hey, don't come crying to us. We're just a platform. We've got nothing to do with the content itself. And that the direction that you're suggesting that might go is that Facebook becomes more like a publisher, that they are actually taking a more active role themselves, perhaps not in, as you say, in that on-off switch, it's either posted or not posted, but in truly curating that content or moderating it by adding that context. Well, that would be a huge change.
It would be. It would be a change. I don't think it would be so very huge, because what informs my perspective on this is that they've already moved away from neutral pretty dramatically, right? And that's actually not entirely new. It just seems to be accelerating lately. But they've already moved in that direction. So if they're going to keep moving in that direction, then maybe we could have a smarter approach to handling the content online than just thinking of it in terms of an on-off switch. That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in. Another thing that I would be remiss if I didn't mention is that given that we know that they make mistakes, all of the platforms make mistakes all the time. The other thing that we need to build into the content moderation approach and content moderation system, in addition to user tools, is transparency and an appeal process. So first of all, we do need to understand better what the platforms are doing, and they're really quite secretive in how they make these decisions. And it's really been interesting because there's been sort of a flood of articles just recently that have given us at least, finally a bit of a window into things. And they're also doing more sort of transparency reports and so on. But we need a lot more of this. We need really detailed information about what comes down, when, and how. But the other thing that we need is a process.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. The other thing we need is a process whereby folks can appeal. So if they think that someone's made a mistake, and sometimes it needs to be a fast process, because what if you're, a citizen journalist, you're posting a video documenting something that's happening in your neighborhood right now. If it's taken down for 2 or 3 weeks, well, everybody thinks about it. By the time it's over, the newsworthiness may have passed. It's past time for anyone to comment or do anything about it. So there's a site called, or several organizations, including my own, have signed off on what we call the Santa Clara Principles.
Yep, I was just going to ask you about that. Yes.
And they include, those kinds of requirements, and we're calling on the companies to agree to adopt them.
And again, that has to be a voluntary commitment, because we're not talking about a new law that you're advocating that would require this. We're asking for companies voluntarily to agree to these principles of transparency and to the practice of creating some type of appeal process, right?
Exactly.
Wow. Fascinating. And we'll see. I mean, there's just going to be more and more ways in which I think this is tested going forward, and challenging, what people think about content and speech and the role of these companies and who's going to have a say in this. And I know you'll be a prominent voice in that conversation going forward as well. So I want to thank you, Corynne, so much for sharing your voice and your experience and point of view on this with our listeners on Good Law, Bad Law. Thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.